Good morning, everybody. Today I'm going to be presenting on the lost chapter from my dissertation, about 15 years and going. So we aim for this project to look at the effects of hydrologic alteration on the growth and hatching success of age 0 catfish in these highly altered systems where hydrologic conditions are altered through dam construction. And of course, we're all pretty well aware of all the various hydrologic alterations that occur through dam construction, modification of in-stream habitat, and there's a long laundry list of things, as you can see there on the screen. And for the sake of saving time, I'm not going to go through each one, but it's pretty substantial, right? And so if you take a look at that picture, that's actually what happens at Thurlow Dam on the lower Tallapoosa River when flows exceed dam capacity. So conditions could be quite extreme, right? And so as far as it relates to fish populations in this particular study, there are two things in particular that I want to focus on. Decreased habitat stability. Decreased habitat stability due to hydropeaking operations often will produce, obviously, a highly variable environment, which could have a negative effect on hatching success and maybe even early growth and result in low recruitment. And then cold water releases, hypoliminal releases from below a dam could potentially slow growth and alter early physiology. Now, in the state of Alabama, on your Coosa and Tallapoosa rivers, there are a total of 10 dams. There are 6 on the main stem of the Coosa River. There are 4 on the Tallapoosa River. And the Tallapoosa River is the system that we focused in on the, oh, wait a minute, here's your pointer. Okay, so on the middle Tallapoosa River below Harris Dam was one section that we focused on, and then on the lower Tallapoosa River below Thurlow Dam. Now, I'll just go ahead and talk briefly about what happened after the Harris Dam was constructed. Of course, after the dam was built, flows were much less stable due to hydropeaking operations, flow variation on a daily basis. Major fluctuations in the temperature regime. Irwin and Freeman documented 10 degrees Celsius changes over a period of a few hours, which obviously would provide a cold shock to fish as they're trying to survive and grow. More specifically, limited habitat suitability due to extreme low flows during dry periods. Flow instability, which I've already mentioned, could have a negative effect on successful hatching and spawning, and lower temperatures, again, due to that hypoliminal release of water. Now, since actually in the past several decades, a number of studies have been conducted that have attempted to link hydrologic conditions to catfish recruitment and growth. A number of them have been conducted. Again, I'm not going to go through all of them, but things like availability of in-stream habitat, like riffle habitats that are important to young of the year flathead catfish and channel catfish, floodplain inundation in the coastal plain, which supports catfish growth, number of flood days, water temperature during the growing season. All these things potentially contribute to the growth and production of catfish. So specifically, as far as our research objectives went, we wanted to assess and analyze early growth histories and hatching success of these catfish in both regulated and unregulated sections in the Tallapoosa River Basin. And based off our findings, quantify a flow regime that would best support the hatching success and early growth of these recently hatched channel catfish. So we're focusing on the first 40 to 60 days of life. And ultimately, this information could be used to inform flow management decisions, more recently using an Aloha approach, which you probably have read about in the literature. So way back when in the early 2000s, when I first was kind of tinkering around with techniques to estimate the daily age of catfish, I tried a whole variety of different techniques using the Lapillus otolith, sagittal sections, transverse sections. And this image right here is near and dear to my heart because this is the first one I ever sectioned successfully. So there's the core. There's some distinct rings that occur during the endogenous feeding period of the fish, and then that transitions into a regular pattern of ring deposition when they transition to exogenous feeding. And so Elise, Irwin, and I conducted a validation study using this technique, and we found that the transverse section worked best. This was a 36-day-old fish, and when we fit the mean ring estimated count against known age, we had a really nice tight relationship. Indicating that using this transverse section of the Lapillus otolith, which is quite extensive to do, it takes a lot of effort, gives you pretty accurate age estimates through almost 3 months post-hatch. And on top of that, there's a really strong relationship between the total length of the fish, the size of the fish, and the otolith size. And I want to point out that this is only for about 40 or so data points with a really robust R-squared value. You're talking about 96% of the variation in fish size can be explained by otolith radius. So basically the idea here is that otolith size, otolith growth could potentially use it, or could be used, we thought, as a proxy for fish growth. So let's get into the methods. I do have a lot of information to present, so hopefully I'll make the time here. But our sampling locations within the Tallapoosa River watershed included 5 locations in the Piedmont above the fall line, 2 being unregulated, the unregulated main stem in the upper Tallapoosa, and an unregulated tributary, Hillaby Creek, and then 3 regulated locations below Harris Dam. In the coastal plain, we had 3 locations, 1 regulated location on Dozier's Bar, and Ufapi and Cobbahachie Creeks, which were also unregulated tributaries. So we had some pretty decent coverage, and this work was done during a larger study. I believe it was the Aquatic Gap Analysis Program, where Elise was conducting a whole bunch of electrofishing sampling in the watershed. And the primary technique that we used were PAEs, those are pre-positioned area electrofishers. Particularly for your juvenile catfish, what you'd want to do is set those off the riffles in the shallow water at night, and then those catfish will come up on the riffles, and then you would shock them using the PAEs. So all fish, of course, were weighed and measured. The Lapilliolus were extracted from each fish. I'm not going to get into the details as far as the otolith processing. We could talk later, but basically you embed the otolith in a clear epoxy resin. You take a high precision sectioning saw to cut out a resin block containing the otolith. You then position that otolith perpendicular to the slide. You sand it down on one side till you get to the core and you see some rings. You flip it over on the other side, you sand it down again. I know a transverse section is much more difficult to get at, but the sagittal section where you just lay the otolith flat on the slide did not work as well, little too inconsistent for the data that we wanted. As far as otolith reading interpretation was conducted, we pretty much followed published techniques. Each otolith was read independently 3 times in random order, and no 2 counts of the same otolith were made consecutively, as described by DiCenzo and Bartoli and Miller and Stalk and a whole bunch of other publications. Once the age was determined, otolith radii were measured from the center of the otolith out towards the edge at 20-day increments, so we could estimate 20-day incremental growth measurements from day 0 all the way out to, I think it was about 126 days was the oldest fish that we had. For analytical methods, we actually accessed hourly flow data instead of the typical daily discharge data that you would access from USGS. Reason being is our rationale was with daily flow data, you're kind of washing out the hourly variation that you would typically see throughout the day, which is of particular importance for fish at a finer temporal scale, right? I mean, if you're using daily data, you're missing maybe some of that important hourly variation that is essential or is going to affect the growth of that fish on a daily basis. And so our code was used to parse out the data into CSV files. Of course, working with hourly data in Excel is impractical. Using that data, let's first talk about t-test. First thing we did was we conducted a very simple t-test to compare growth between the coastal plain and the Piedmont, as well as regulated versus unregulated sections within the Piedmont, to assess relations between hydrology and hatch. For each period of record, we computed 25% quartiles across the hourly flow data accessed from each site. And then what we did was we took each individual hatch and superimposed it on that particular hydrograph to first find which quartile of flow that hatch occurred in, but also to identify patterns in the hydrograph where those hatches occurred. We also used our code to extract hourly discharge data for each 20-day increment, and using that data, we computed a whole bunch of ecologically relevant parameters, which are listed there, which I'll cover in a second. Our code was then used to perform a number of multiple regression analyses, which took into account the physiographic province that the fish was collected in a variety of discharge characteristics, and the best predictive models were ranked by AIC. All right, so let's go ahead and get right into the results. We saw a lot of variation in channel catfish growth, and that's pretty typical for catfish. As far as the data that we collected, unfortunately, only 91 age-0 channel catfish. I was never thrilled with that sample size, but that wasn't for a lack of effort. And from those 91 channel catfish, we were able to measure 274 growth increments. So a decent data set for analyzing growth. On the whole, I guess overall, in the coastal plain, your channel catfish grew about 1.83 to 1.5 millimeters per day, which was significantly greater than the growth that we observed in the Piedmont, 0.6 to 1.07. Ages ranged up to 90 days in the coastal plain that we aged, and then 126 in the Piedmont. When we compared growth between coastal plain and Piedmont, fish in the coastal plain grew significantly faster at all 20-day increments compared to the Piedmont. And when you break down the Piedmont locations between regulated and unregulated, in the first 20 days there was no difference, but in the successive days after that, 20 to 40 and 40 to 60, fish in the regulated sections grew faster than those in the unregulated. And if I don't have time later to discuss this, we think that in the bigger regulated section, once these fish get big enough, due to lower population densities, they may just grow better. Taking a look at the hatch frequencies between coastal plain and Piedmont, in both locations, the hatches started out in early June. In the coastal plain, that continued into August. In the Piedmont, we observed hatches in September to mid-September, particularly in those regulated sections. So one thing about the Piedmont location, we had 39 data points, but they split evenly between unregulated and regulated. And we noticed that those fish from the regulated reaches hatched later in the spawning period compared to those fish in the unregulated reaches. And there's more to this story, which I'm going to get into right now. Okay, so for Fatby Creek, which is an unregulated tributary, this is what the hydrograph looks like on an hourly basis from day to day. And we superimpose the hatches on this hydrograph, and if right off the bat, what you notice is the majority of these hatches occurred in the upper 2 quartiles of flow, so during higher flow periods. And the other thing that you notice is the majority of the hatches occurred on these descending limbs of pulses, with a big one right there, some right there, and several right there. Okay, so as the flows are receding, the hatches are occurring. When we take a look at Hillaby Creek, which was the unregulated tributary in the Piedmont, similar pattern. You've got the hatches occurring on this descending limb of the pulse. On the trough there, you could see of the pulse there. Following those events, you have a whole bunch of pulses where we observed only one hatch. That begs the question, did hatches actually occur during that period? Or did they occur in between those events, and did the fish go somewhere? So when you go ahead and superimpose the hatches for the fish from the regulated reach on the Hillaby hydrograph, this is one of the coolest things I thought of the study is you can see the hatches of the regulated fish correspond very nicely to the hydrograph in the unregulated tributary. This would indicate that these fish hatched in the unregulated tributary, and then these strong pulses likely washed the fish out into the regulated reach. Okay. As far as growth went, we saw no relationship in growth between the first 20 days and from 20 to 40 days. So growth in the increment from 20 to 40 was statistically independent of growth during the first 20 days. That was not the same for the relationship between growth in 40 to 60 to growth 20 to 40. The growth after 40 days was dependent on how well the fish grew in the previous increment. And I'll talk more about that if I have the time as we go through the data. As far as the regression models went, we saw no significant hydro models for the earliest increment. However, once you got to the 20 to 40 day increment, we had top rank models that included the physiographic province, which I already mentioned was important. High pulse frequencies was highly significant, and the number of reversals as a quadratic function was also highly significant. Notice the growth during the previous period was not included as an explanatory variable in this model because remember, I already established there was statistical independence between the growth during the first 20 days and then during the growth during the 20 to 40 day period. What do the plots look like? Well, they're not pretty, but they show a general relationship. In general, as the number of reversals increases, the growth of the fish increases, tends to level off and decline. The coastal plain fish seem to have benefited by an increased number of reversals, but when the number of reversals become too frequent, that has a negative effect on growth. The fish from the Piedmont, surprisingly, on an hourly basis, were subjected to a fewer number of reversals. If you take a look at high pulse frequency, the fish in the coastal plain during that particular year didn't experience high pulses. The fish from the Piedmont did. And as you can see there, there's a general decline in growth. That's, by the way, for the 20 to 40 day period as the number of high pulses increases. If you take a look at the growth during the 40 to 60 day period, the top model, there was really only one of them, included D40. D40 is the growth in the previous period. Remember I said that growth in the 40 to 60 day period was not independent of growth in the previous period. So that was included in the model and came out highly significant. And then the number of reversals as a quadratic function also came up significant. And if you could see the relationship there, again, it's not the prettiest thing in the world, but on the lower end for your Piedmont fish, there appears to be a pretty sharp increase in growth with an increase in the number of reversals. It reaches a maximum, and then once you get too many reversals and the flow conditions become a bit too variable, there's actually a decline in growth. Now also keep in mind, a lot of this scatter that you're seeing is probably due to fish that grew really well in that previous increment. Fish that grew well in the previous increment did better in the next one, in the 40 to 60 day increment. And so some of that variation is going to be explained also just by how well they grew from 20 to 40 days. All right, so now we can get into the discussion. So growth of age 0 channel catfish was highly variable across the Tallapoosa Basin. It was highest in the coastal plain. We partly attribute that to probably floodplain inundation. Increased access to the floodplain provides a terrestrial source of nutrients, refuge that may support growth and survival of these young fish. One really interesting thing that we noticed, and I'll skip directly to the next slide so you can see this. When you superimpose the hatches for those regulated fish on top of the Hilleby hydrograph, you can see some commonalities there and how well the hatches correspond to the unregulated tributaries hydrograph. I probably should mention at this point that one reason why we did this is we saw no correlation in the hatches with the hydrograph of the regulated main stem. So this leads us to believe that these fish hatched in Hilleby and then got flushed out. This is another really interesting thing right here. You can see there's actually a period of hatch that occurred simultaneously, which again would suggest that these fish in that regulated site originated there. Okay, and so that would suggest that these fish are using the unregulated tributaries as their spawning and nursery site, upon which maybe a heavy flood event then flushes them out into the main stem. As far as growth went, growth of the channel catfish on the first 20 days was not strongly linked to hydrology. That kind of makes sense because the growth in the first 20 days is going to be obviously linked to parental care, maternal investment in terms of yolk sac, as well as active parental care, after which the fish will leave the nest and transition to exogenous feeding. So their success in that next 20-day increment is probably more related to their success in that transition to exogenous feeding than how much yolk they received in that first period, for example. When considering both factors, a lower frequency of high pulses and a moderate number of reversals seem to support growth. And when we take all these factors together in terms of flow management recommendations, and we consider everything in terms of spawning and growth, we would take this information and suggest that minimizing large releases of water to avoid exceptionally high peaks of flow during the spawning season could promote successful spawning and hatching of these channel catfish. And as far as growth, it seemed a lower to moderate frequency of high pulses and a moderate number of reversals would support the growth of these fish. We believe to sufficiently inundate riparian and allowing for better access to littoral habitats during the spawning season and the growth period. And I'm completely out of time, right?
You have 1 minute.
I have 1 minute. Oh, wow, I did pretty good. Okay. All right. So, but anyway, I'll take some questions. First of all, I just want to thank my PhD advisory committee way back when in 2002. They were essential in my development. Mike Messina, Steve Dobson, and Mary Freeman, as well as all the students that helped with the sampling way back when in 2002 to 2006. And so I'll go ahead and take some questions.
All right, we have time for a very quick question if there is one. Okay, I
All right.
think we'll move on then. Thank you,
Thanks.
Peter.
See ya.